The Middy and the Moors, Chapter 1 by R. M. Ballantyne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel. The Middy and the Moors, an Algerine story. The hero is blown away, captured, crushed, comforted, and astonished. One beautiful summer night, about the beginning of the present century, a young naval officer entered the public drawing-room of a hotel at Nice, and glanced round as if in search of someone. Many people were assembled there, some in robust, others in delicate health, many in that condition which rendered it doubtful to which class they belonged, but all engaged in the quiet buzz of conversation which, in such a place, is apt to set in after dinner. The young Englishman, for such he evidently was, soon observed an elderly lady beckoning to him at the other end of the salon, and was quickly seated between her and a fragile girl, whose hand he gently took hold of. "Mother," he said to the elderly lady, "I'm going to have a row in the Mediterranean. The night is splendid, the air balmy, the stars gorgeous." "Now, George," interrupted the girl with a little smile, "don't be flowery. We knew all about that."
"Too bad," returned the youth. "I never rise to poetry in your presence, Minnie, without being snubbed. But you cannot cure me. Romance is too deeply ingrained in my soul. Poetry flows from me like anything. I am a midshipman in the British Navy, a position which affords scope for the wildest enthusiasm, and I'll astonish you yet. See if I don't."
"I'm sure you will, dear boy," said his mother, and she believed that he would. "Of course you will," added his sister, and she at least hoped that he would. To say truth, there was nothing about the youth, as regards appearance or character, which rendered either the assurance or the hope unwarrantable. He was not tall, but he was strong and active. He was not exactly handsome, but he was possessed of a genial, hearty disposition, a playful spirit, and an earnest soul, also a modestly reckless nature, which was quite captivating. "You won't be anxious about me, mother, if I don't return till pretty late," he said, rising. "I want a good long refreshing pull, but I'll be back in time to say good night to you, Minnie, before you go to sleep." "Your leave expires on Thursday, mind," said his sister. "We cannot spare you long." "I shall be back in good time, trust me. Au revoir," he said, with a pleasant nod, as he left the room. And they did trust him, for our midshipman, George Foster, was trustworthy; but those circumstances over which people have no control are troublesome derangers of the affairs of man. That was the last the mother and sister saw of George for the space of nearly 2 years. Taking his way to the pebbly shore, young Foster hired a small boat, or punt, from a man who knew him well, declined the owner's services, pushed off, seized the oars, and rowed swiftly out to sea. It was, as he had said, a splendid night. The stars bespangled the sky like diamond dust. The water was as clear as a mirror, and the lights of Nice seemed to shoot far down into its depths. The hum of the city came off with ever-deepening softness as the distance from the shore increased. The occasional sound of oars was heard not far off, though boats and rowers were invisible, for there was no moon, and the night was dark notwithstanding the starlight. There was no fear, however, of the young sailor losing himself while the city lights formed such a glorious beacon astern. After pulling steadily for an hour or more, he rested on his oars, gazed up at the bright heavens, and then at the land lights, which by that time resembled a twinkling line on the horizon. "Must 'bout ship now," he muttered. "Won't do to keep Minnie waiting." As he rowed leisurely landward, a sudden gust of wind from the shore shivered the liquid mirror into fragments. It was the advance guard of a squall, which in a few minutes rushed down from the mountains of the Riviera, and swept out upon the darkening sea. Young Foster, as we have said, was strong. He was noted among his fellows as a splendid oarsman. The squall, therefore, did not disconcert him, though it checked his speed greatly. After 1 or 2 lulls the wind increased to a gale, and in half an hour the youth found, with some anxiety, that he was making no headway against it. The shore at that point was so much of a straight line as to render the hope of being able to slant in a faint one. As it was better, however, to attempt that than to row straight into the teeth of the gale, he diverged towards a point a little to the eastward of the port of Nice, and succeeded in making better way through the water, though he made no perceptible approach to land. "Pooh! It's only a squall. Be over in a minute," said the middy, by way of encouraging himself, as he glanced over his shoulder at the flickering lights, which were now barely visible. He was wrong. The gale increased. Next time he glanced over his shoulder the lights were gone. Dark clouds were gathering up from the northward, and a short jabble of sea was rising, which occasionally sent a spurt of spray inboard. Feeling now that his only chance of regaining the shore lay in a strong, steady, persevering pull straight towards it, he once more turned the bow of the little boat into the wind's eye, and gave way with a will. But what could human muscle and human will, however powerful, do against a rampant nor'wester? Very soon our hero was forced to rest upon his oars from sheer exhaustion, while his boat drifted slowly out to sea. The thought of his mother and Minnie flashed upon him, and with a sudden gush, as it were, of renewed strength, he resumed his efforts, and strained his powers to the uttermost, but all in vain. Something akin to despair now seized on him, for the alternative was to drift out into the open ocean, where no friendly island lay between him and the shores of Africa. The necessity for active exertion, however, gave him no time either to rest or think. As the distance from land increased, the seas rose higher, and broke so frequently over the boat that it began to fill. To stop rowing, at least to the extent of keeping the bow to the wind, would have risked turning broadside on, and, being overturned or swamped, there was nothing, therefore, to be done in the circumstances except to keep the boat's head to the wind and drift. In the midst of the rushing gale and surging seas, he sat there, every gleam of hope almost extinguished, when there came to his mind a brief passage from the Bible, "Hope thou in God." Many a time had his mother tried, in days gone by, to impress that text on his mind, but apparently without success. Now it rose before him like a beacon star. At the same time he thought of the possibility that he might be seen and picked up by a passing vessel. He could not but feel, however, that the chances of this latter event occurring were small indeed, for a passing ship or boat would not only be going at great speed, but would be very unlikely to see his cockle-shell in the darkness, or to hear his cry in the roaring gale. Still he grasped that hope as the drowning man is said to clutch at a straw. And the hope was quickly fulfilled, for scarcely had another half-hour elapsed when he observed a sail, a high-peaked sail peculiar to some Mediterranean craft, rise, ghost-like, out of the driving foam and spray. The vessel was making almost straight for him. He knew that it would pass before there could be time to heave a rope. At the risk of being run down, he rowed the punt in front of it, as if courting destruction, but at the same time guided his little craft so skilfully that it passed close to leeward, where the vessel's bulwarks were dipping into the water. Our Middy's aim was so exact that the vessel only grazed the boat as it flew past. In that moment, young Foster sprang with the agility of a cat, capsized the boat with the impulse, caught the bulwarks and rigging of the vessel, and in another moment stood panting on her deck.
"Hello, Neptune, what do you want here?" cried a gruff voice at Foster's elbows.
At the same time a powerful hand grasped his throat, and a lantern was thrust in his face. "Let go, and I will tell you," gasped the youth, restraining his indignation at such unnecessary violence. The grasp tightened, however, instead of relaxing.
"Speak out, baby face," roared the voice, referring, in the latter expression, no doubt, to our hero's juvenility. Instead of speaking out, George Foster hit out, and the voice with the lantern went down into the lee scuppers. Then, the glare of the lantern being removed from his eyes, George saw, by the light of the binnacle lamp, that his adversary, a savage-looking Turk, at least in dress, was gathering himself up for a rush, and that the steersman, a huge negro, was grinning from ear to ear. "Go below,"
said a deep, stern voice in the Arabic tongue. The effect of this order was to cause the Turk with the broken lantern to change his mind, and retire with humility, while it solemnized the negro steersman's face almost miraculously. The speaker was the captain of the vessel, a man of grave demeanour, Herculean mould, and clothed in picturesque Eastern costume. Turning with quiet politeness to Foster, he asked him in broken French how he had come on board. The youth explained in French quite as much broken as that of his interrogator. "Do you speak English?" he added. To this the captain replied in English, still more shattered than his French, that he could "very leetle," but that as he, the youth, was a prisoner, there would be no occasion for speech at all, the proper attitude of a prisoner being that of absolute silence and obedience to orders. "A prisoner!" ejaculated Foster, on recovering from the first shock of surprise. "Do you know that I am an officer in the navy of His Majesty the King of Great Britain?" A gleam of satisfaction lighted up the swarthy features of the Turk for a moment, as he replied, "Ver good. Ransom all the more greater." As he spoke, a call from the lookout at the bow of the vessel induced him to hurry forward. At the same instant, a slight hissing sound caused Foster to turn to the steersman, whose black face was alive with intelligence, while an indescribable hitch up of his chin seemed to beckon the youth to approach with caution. Foster perceived at once that the man wished his communication, whatever it was, to be observed by no one. He therefore moved towards him as if merely to glance at the compass. "Massa," said the negro, without looking at Foster, or changing a muscle of his now stolid visage, "you's in a dreffle fix. Dis here am a pirate, but I's not a pirate. Bress you, I's was no dat. I's a awful hypocrite, and I wants to give you good adwice. Whatever you do, don't resist. You'll only get whacked if you do." "Thank you, Sambo. But what if I do resist in spite of being whacked?" "Den you'll very soon change your mind, dat's all. Moreover, my name's not Sambo, it am Peter the Great." As he said so, Peter the Great drew himself up to his full height, and he drew himself up to 6 feet 4 when he did that. The captain, coming aft at the moment, put an abrupt end to the conversation. 2 powerful Moorish seamen accompanied him. These, without uttering a word, seized Foster by the arms. In the strength of his indignation our Middy was on the point of commencing a tremendous struggle, when Peter the Great's "don't resist," and the emphasis with which it had been spoken, came to mind, and he suddenly gave in. His hands were tied behind his back, and he was led down into a small, dimly lighted cabin, where, being permitted to sit down on a locker, he was left to his own reflections. These were by no means agreeable, as may well be supposed, for now he knew that he had fallen into the hands of those pests, the Algerine pirates, who at that time infested the Mediterranean. With the thoughtlessness of youth, Foster had never troubled his mind much about the piratical city of Algiers. Of course he knew that it was a stronghold on the northern coast of Africa, inhabited by Moorish rascals, who, taking advantage of their position, issued from their port, and pounced upon merchantmen that entered the Mediterranean, confiscating their cargoes and enslaving their crews and passengers, or holding them to ransom. He also knew, or had heard, that some of the great maritime powers paid subsidies to the Dey of Algiers, to allow the vessels of their respective nations to come and go unmolested, but he could scarcely credit the latter fact. It seemed to him, as indeed it was, preposterous. "For," said he to the brother Middy, who had given them the information, "would not the nations whom the Dey had the impudence to tax join their fleets together, pay him an afternoon visit one fine day, and blow him and his Moors and Turks and city into a heap of rubbish?" What, the Middy replied, we have no means of knowing, but certain it is that his information was correct, for some of the principal nations did, at that time, submit to the degradation of this tax, and they did not unite their fleets for the extinction of the pirates. Poor George Foster now began to find out that the terrible truths which he had refused to believe were indeed great realities, and had now begun to affect himself. He experienced an awful sinking of the heart when it occurred to him that no one would ever know anything about his fate, for the little boat would be sure to find bottom up, sooner or later, and it would of course be assumed that he had been drowned. Shall it be said that the young midshipman was weak, or wanting in courage, because he bowed his head and wept when the full force of his condition came home to him? Nay, verily, for there was far more of grief for the prolonged agony that was in store for his mother and sister than for the fate that awaited himself. He prayed as well as wept. "God help me and them!" he exclaimed aloud. The prayer was brief but sincere, perhaps the more sincere because so brief. At all events it was that acknowledgment of utter helplessness which secures the help of the Almighty arm. Growing weary at last, he stretched himself on the locker, and with the facility of robust health, fell into a sound sleep. Youth, strength, and health are not easily incommoded by wet garments. Besides, the weather was unusually warm at the time. How long he slept he could not tell, but the sun was high when he awoke, and his clothes were quite dry. Other signs there were that he had slept long, such as the steadiness of the breeze, and the more regular motion of the vessel, which showed that the gale was over and the sea going down. There was also a powerful sensation in what he styled his bread basket, though it might, with equal truth, have been called his meat and vegetable basket, which told him more eloquently than anything else of the lapse of time. Rising from his hard couch and endeavouring to relieve the aching of the bound arms by change of position, he observed that the cabin hatch was open, and that nothing prevented his going on deck, if so disposed. Accordingly he ascended, though with some difficulty, owing to his not having been trained to climb a ladder in a rough sea without the use of his hands. A Moor, he observed, had taken his friend Peter the Great's place at the tiller, and the captain stood near the stern, observing a passing vessel. A stiffish but steady breeze carried them swiftly over the waves, which, we might say, laughingly reflected the bright sunshine and the deep blue sky. Several vessels of different rigs and nationalities were sailing in various directions, both near and far away. Going straight to the captain with an air of good-humoured sang-froid, which was peculiar to him, Foster said, "Captain, don't you think I've had these bits of rope yarn on my wrists long enough? I'm not used, you see, to walking the deck without the use of my hands, and a heavy lurch, like as not, would send me slap into the lee scuppers, sailor though I be. Besides, I won't jump overboard without leave, you may rely upon that. Neither will I attempt, single-handed, to fight your entire crew, so you needn't be afraid." The stern Moor evidently understood part of this speech, and he was so tickled with the last remark, that his habitual gravity gave place to the faintest flicker of a smile, while a twinkle gleamed for a moment in his eye. Only for a moment, however. Pointing over the side, he bade his prisoner look. Foster looked, and beheld, in the far distance, a three-masted vessel that seemed to bear a strong resemblance to a British man-of-war. "You promise," said the captain, "not shout or roar?" "I promise," answered our Middy, "neither to shout nor roar, for my doing either, even though like a bull of Bashan, would be of no earthly use at this distance." "Englishmans," said the captain, "niver brooked a word." After paying this scarcely deserved compliment, he gave an order to a sailor who was coiling up ropes near him, and the man at once proceeded to untie Foster's bonds. "My good fellow," said the midshipman, observing that his liberator was the man whom he had knocked down the night before, "I'm sorry I had to floor you, but it was impossible to help it, you know. An Englishman is like a bulldog. He won't suffer himself to be seized by the throat and choked if he can help it." The Turk, who was evidently a renegade Briton, made no reply whatever to this address, but, after casting the lashings loose, returned to his former occupation. Foster proceeded to thank the captain for his courtesy, and made him acquainted with the state of his appetite, but he was evidently not in a conversational frame of mind. Before a few words had been spoken, the captain stopped him, and, pointing down the skylight, said sharply, "Breakfast, go!" Both look and tone admonished our hero to obey. He descended to the cabin, therefore, without finishing his sentence, and there discovered that "breakfast" consisted of 2 sea biscuits and a mug of water. To these dainties he applied himself with infinite relish, for he had always been Spartan-like as to the quality of his food, and hunger makes almost any kind of dish agreeable. While thus engaged he heard a hurried trampling of feet on deck. mingled with sharp orders from the captain. At first he thought the sounds might have been reference to taking in a reef to prepare for a squall, but as the noise rather increased, his curiosity was aroused, and he was about to return on deck when Peter the Great suddenly leaped into the cabin, and took hurriedly from the opposite locker a brace of highly ornamented pistols and a scimitar. "What's wrong, Peter?" asked Foster, starting up.
"We's a going to fight," groaned the negro. "Oh, I's an awful hypocrite. You stop where you are, massa, or else you'll get whacked."
Despite the risk of being whacked, the youth would have followed the negro on deck, had not the hatch been slammed in his face and secured. Next moment he heard a volley of musketry on deck. It was instantly replied to by a distant volley, and immediately thereafter groans and curses showed that the firing had not been without effect. That the pirate had engaged a vessel of some sort was evident, and our hero, being naturally anxious to see if not to share in the fight, tried hard to get out of his prison, but without success. He was obliged, therefore, to sit there inactive and listen to the wild confusion overhead. At last there came a crash, followed by fiercer shouts and cries. He knew that the vessels had met, and that the pirates were boarding. In a few minutes comparative silence ensued, broken only by occasional footsteps and the groaning of the wounded. End of the Middy and the Moors, Chapter 1, by R. M. Ballantyne.